Thanks to Teresita and Victoria and to Ismael for putting this event together. Let me try to get out of this and put my show. This can't be moved, right? Okay, got it. All right. Thanks to Harry also for giving you some background on kind of how we got to where we are today and some potential solutions for the crisis. Puerto Rico has multiple crises overlapping at the same time. It's not just one crisis. There's most certainly a social dimension to the crisis with declining population and increased out-migration. There's an economic dimension to the crisis reflected in reductions in employment and flattening of incomes, and Harry presented some of that data. There's a fiscal dimension to the crisis reflected in high levels of government debt. And there's certainly a political dimension to the crisis, as everything having to do with Puerto Rico has to do with politics. What I want to do in the time that I have here is to walk you through a critique of a report issued by the government of Puerto Rico around the same time that the governor made the announcement that the debt couldn't be paid. They had commissioned Ann Krueger, who was a former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, to write kind of a blueprint justifying why the government was taking the stance that it was taking, that the debt was unpayable. And in that report, they went through an analysis of Puerto Rico's fiscal situation and also made some recommendations in their eyes of things they thought Puerto Rico should do to change its course and maybe come out of the crisis. This report essentially became a blueprint for one set of working groups that the government has put together to issue what they call the Plan de Ajuste Fiscal, which is supposed to be released at the end of August, but because of Erica, government claimed it didn't have enough time to finish dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, and needed until today, when the governor met at 3:30 with the legislature to tell them what was in the report, and then tomorrow apparently is going to be released to the public. So the underpinnings of this report, and I'm particularly concerned about, as the title of my presentation suggests, about the education, minimum wage, welfare, employment, income relationship in Puerto Rico. That is very central to the arguments in this report. And what I did was essentially took a close reading of the report, hoping that after all the hundreds of thousands of dollars that the Government Development Bank had invested in producing this report, I would be inundated with data supporting the propositions advanced in the report. And I was unpleasantly surprised to realize that the data that I was looking for was not there, and perhaps I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The report's called the Krueger Report. And what I did was, you can go over the different sections of the report, and there's an argument about Puerto Rico being a low-skilled place. Kind of low education, there's a bunch of low education, low-skilled people, that employment laws are too generous. And at some point, there's even a complaint about breastfeeding breaks that women supposedly get, and how that's a problem because it's too generous. And that the minimum wage, of course, is too high and too generous. And you hear the word generous coming up in this report a lot around employment laws, around the minimum wage, and especially given that Puerto Rico is this low-skilled place. Then there's more arguments about welfare being too generous, and they throw a number in there that a person, a family of 3 on welfare can make more money than if they were working. And they throw the number and they don't put any citation, any reference, no backup of where that number comes from, simply just throw it out there. And I've asked a lot of people, where that number come from? And they're like, well, but they didn't make it up. It must come from somewhere. I found out where it came from, and it's really shaky. But I'll walk you through kind of my recalculations of that number. But welfare is now a disincentive to work. People rather sit at home, collect the check, this generous welfare, and that explains why Puerto Rico's participation is really low. You know, very generous welfare. People rather just stay at home and chill. So in the end, they say in the report, employment laws are very generous, welfare is very generous. welfare is a disincentive to work, employment laws should be reduced and streamlined and eliminated, and welfare payments should be cut to kind of push people back to the labor market. So they summarize the summary of their argument is essentially that Puerto Rico's a low-skilled place, welfare is too generous, employment laws are too generous, the minimum wage is too high and generous, of course, welfare is a disincentive to work, and therefore labor force participation is low. So labor force participation is low because the welfare is too generous and the minimum wage is too high, which means that people can't afford to hire workers. It's essentially the bottom line of their argument. And my sense is that that as the economic crisis in Puerto Rico has gained more public attention, we have like a good news, bad news situation. The good news is that we'll talk more about Puerto Rico. Thanks for being here. It's important that we discuss it. The bad news is that we're talking about Puerto Rico in ways that are wildly distorted and that promote these kinds of stereotypes that I've been talking about, which I call this kind of colonial mythology of the undeserving, lazy Puerto Rican, right? We can cut down to kind of the essence. And again, I was kind of looking for an attempt to find some data to support this, and I basically did not find much. And what makes this mythology powerful is that it capitalizes on the worst colonial stereotypes, it obscures real problems, and it helps advance really particularistic agendas. Also, a lot of people in Puerto Rico and beyond actually believe these myths and can point to all kinds of stories and anecdotal evidence that confirm these myths about the ayudas that are true. You know how many people, and I want to one of my dreams is to do a documentary where I interview everybody in Puerto Rico that says, well, but gente en caserío, they have a television and they have a car, and this kind of mythology. And what happens is that in a class anxiety, or in the class anxiety of a consumer society where the incomes have been flat, people punch down, and they look for explanations by pointing to the benefits of those that are better off. But when you scratch beyond that surface, you find that the story is not true. So there are 6 myths about Puerto Rico that I think we should unpack and deconstruct and destroy. Number 1, that Puerto Rico has low levels of education. I'll walk you through the data. It's not, Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? But it ain't some backwater, low education place. And I'll kind of show you some numbers that show that. And all I'm saying here is also part of a larger presentation that has about 90 slides that anybody that wants it, just give me your email address or email me and I can send it to you and you can see the full deck that I don't have time to present, obviously, today. Puerto Rico has low levels of education. People in Puerto Rico do not want to work. This is the second myth. Third myth, welfare payments are too generous. The fourth myth, welfare is a disincentive to work and able-bodied working-age males can get welfare easily, right? You just don't have to work and decide to chill in your couch and the check will come in the mail. It's as easy as that, as you hear it from the stories. The minimum wage is too high, as Harry and others have tried to address and deconstruct, have addressed and tried to deconstruct. And low-wage workers, the poor, and other vulnerable populations are to blame for Puerto Rico's financial and economic crisis. Just spend too much money after bad, lazy people. And that's kind of how we borrow all this money to give services to all these bad, lazy people that want to sit at their home and not work. And that's how Puerto Rico's problems got to where they are. So in the rest of the time I have left, my job is to try to destroy each and every one of these myths by kind of pointing to some data that can help us at least try to see whether the trends are true or not. Myth number 1, Puerto Rico has low levels of education, it's a low human capital economy. Again, in the bigger deck, you can see a bunch of slides and read my comments. If there's anything that's been converging between Puerto Rico and the United States, it's been education. Wages haven't converged, incomes haven't converged, okay? And employment rates haven't converged, but education over the last 40 years between Puerto Rico and the US has converged. And what you have here is the educational distribution for persons 25 years or older in Puerto Rico in 2013, all right? So you have 28.9% of the population that's, say, high school drop, and this is 25 and over. It includes people that are 80, 90, right? So 28.9% of the population less than high school, 26.4% of the population with a high school degree, and 44.7% of the population has some college experience, including 32% that have some kind of college degree. 32%, 1 in 3. Does that sound like a low education, backwater, Latin American kind of stereotype place to you? Doesn't to me. Again, it's not Cambridge, Massachusetts, but you have 32% of the population with some kind of college degree. You have 44% of the population with some kind of college experience. So if you compare 65-year-olds in Puerto Rico with 65-year-olds in the US, there's a huge education gap. But when you compare 45-year-olds, the gap narrows. When you compare 25-year-olds, Puerto Rico's about average in terms of especially the lower educated states of the United States. So if Puerto Rico is a low educated backwater place, well, so is Alabama, and so is Mississippi, and so is Louisiana. Puerto Rico is no less educated than any of those places. Point number one, okay? And I can show you tons of slides on all this stuff, but one I'll say, well, it ain't Cambridge, but it's not a backwater education place. Puerto Ricans don't want to work. The unemployment rate in Puerto Rico, what you have here on the top, 225,000 persons on the top, 125,000 persons at the bottom. And you see it oscillating with the different business cycles, but there's no year where there's less than 125,000 people in Puerto Rico looking for work every goddamn day of the week. 125,000 people. And then, so that's the unemployment rate. People don't want to work, so if people don't want to work, why are there 125,000 people looking for work if they don't want to work? And then you see the out-migration on the top. The bottom line is people returning to Puerto Rico. The top line is people leaving Puerto Rico. And you see that the gap is increasing since 2006, right? People leaving. And they don't leave to go chill at some nice beach in Connecticut, if they can be in Combate, right? They go to work. And if you look at the labor force participation rate of Puerto Ricans in the U.S., it's huge compared to that of Puerto Rico because they don't come to chill, they come to work. So this, and you see the population trend of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. at the bottom, already exceeding the population in Puerto Rico, which is kind of flattening, right? So if Puerto Ricans don't want to work, why are there 125,000 people or more looking for work every week? And why are there 40, 50,000 leaving every year to the U.S. to look for work? That's 200,000 people actively we have evidence that are looking for work in a place where, quote unquote, people don't want to look for work. And sounds like stereotype to me. And this kind of summarizes the point, but I want you to look at the point before last. I did the calculation last night. I was listening to Bill Spriggs on WBAI on Labor Day, talking about the working poor in the US. And I said, well, let me look at the working poor, which was like 10% of full-time workers in the US. They work 52 weeks of the year, earn poverty wages. The number of Puerto Rico is 17.8%. There are people that are working 50 to 52 weeks a year, 172,000 people. Working 50 to 52 weeks a year, making below poverty wages. So it's 125,000 people looking for work, there's 50, 60,000 people migrating, and there's 175,000 people working for poverty wages in a place where people don't want to work. And I move to the next one. Welfare payments are too generous. Let's look at the data. What do you mean by generosity? Let's look at dollars. I look at generosity by dollars and cents. Show me the money. How much money are we talking about if people are giving to Puerto Rico? First, that Krueger Report gets this data from some other report that was done, and I was involved in part of that, and I kind of find the number to show where this number came from, and then I recalculate the numbers because number one, the number says this is how much people get from TANF, but when you actually look at the TANF data, the actual payment is about half of what is in the paper. They looked at some table that says this is the maximum a family can get, and plugged that number into their model. And I'm saying that's nonsense. You have to plug the number that people actually get. So that reduces the gap, that gap supposed to happen between employment. And the second thing is that this report has a household of 1 person, 2 persons, 3 persons, 4 persons, up to 8 people with 1 worker only. So welfare goes up with the number of kids, but their earnings don't go up because it's just 1 worker. It's nonsense. A household with 8 people doesn't have the same number of workers as a household with 1 person. In fact, a household of 3 people, if it's 3 adults, that's 1 set of workers. If it's 2 adults and 1 child, that's another set of workers. If it's 1 adult and 2 children, that's another set of workers, especially if the children are under 6. Okay, so they don't make any of these adjustments or any of that. So I went to the TANF data, looked at it. Those are the last 2 columns, 3 columns at the bottom, on the side. It says TANF data, June 2015. There's 63,733 people in this TANF program in Puerto Rico, out of a poor population of 1.6 million people. You know, 66,000 people, okay? And of those, 71% would make more if they worked than if they stayed in the program. So they're not in the program because they make more money, they're in the program because they need to be in the program, because they don't find work. And the large proportion, as I'll show you a little bit later, are elderly, minors, or disabled. Okay, this is 78,000 people in this program out of 1.6 million. Okay, so there's no way that this subsidy pays more than work because people don't have access to this subsidy. It's a fiction that everybody's getting. Now, PAN is a separate program. That's the nutritional assistance. $300 for a family of 3, which I don't consider generous on a kind of cash basis. It's, okay, una comprita, but that's, people don't stop earning $1,500 to get a completa for $300. They get a completa for $300 because they don't want their children to starve to death, okay? That kind of seems pretty basic to me. And so I recalculate the numbers, and then I look at the duration of people in TANF. The people in Puerto Rico spend a long time in this welfare program. We hear stories about generations. It's a lifetime. And then about the generosity of the payments. That's the data. I don't want you to look at the data. I just want you to see where Puerto Rico is. You don't have to. You can see that from everywhere. That's the arranged by the amount of payments from the Alaska, which gives you the biggest welfare payments at about $580-some a month, all the way down to Guam, which is $22. But Puerto Rico is right between Indiana and Oklahoma at $197 a month. $197 a month is the average program for people in the quote-unquote welfare program in Puerto Rico. It's the average monthly payment, $197 a month. So, and then the column next to it is the number of months on average that people are on TANF. So I just graphed the data, put one against the other. Along the top, you see the amount of money that people get. Along the side, you see the number of months that they spend in the program. And guess where Puerto Rico is? Puerto Rico is in the low quadrant. Low payments, low duration. Every state that is to the right, the people in that state last longer in the TANF program than Puerto Rico. Every state that's to the top of Puerto Rico, the people in that state make more money on welfare than they make in Puerto Rico. So generous in relation to what? To Zimbabwe? Sure. But generous if you compare it to every other state, and Puerto Rico's been a part of the US for over 110 years, so it's reasonable for us to compare ourselves to our master in some way. Then they don't look like they last longer on welfare, and they don't look like it's any more generous than any of the other states, at least to my eyes. So I summarized kind of those points that I've been verbally discussing. Number 4, then this generous welfare that we give people in Puerto Rico is supposed to be some kind of disincentive to work because people rather sit at home and cash in. First of all, the labor force participation rate in Puerto Rico, and you can compute it in different ways. They use the 40%. That's 40% of people over 16 are in the labor force. But is the people over 16 the right denominator for that equation? So if you do that, you get 46.3% using the census data. The next panel, I say, well, but let's say we have ages 25 to 64. That would seem a more reasonable working population. Do I want my 16 or 17-year-olds to be working full-time? Do I want my 85-year-olds to be working full-time? No, so let me chop the population. That gives you a participation rate of 61%. But that has some people that are disabled, about 9 to 10% of them. Do we expect disabled folks, blind? You know, they may work, but do we expect them and we're going to count them? Well, let's take them off the denominator. Well, that goes to about 69%. So you go from a 40% participation rate to a 69% participation rate if you make some adjustments for age and adjustments for disability. So it doesn't look as low as they like it to look when you actually make some reasonable adjustments. And then this is the data on the 65,744 people that are in that TANF program. I just did a three-way cut. I looked at gender, male, female, age, young, less than 18, adult, between 18 and 65, and elderly, over 65. And then I did disabled and not disabled. 1.2% of the 65,000 TANF cases, 790 people, are males that are adults and that are not disabled. And you know why they're in the program? Because they're taking care of children that have serious disabilities and they can't work, not because they can't work, but because their children need care, and that's why they also qualify for the program, because they're very poor. So poor fathers, typically, because the mother's absent for some other reason. So think you're a poor person, you get into a car accident, the wife dies, the kid ends up disabled. Yeah, you may end up in the TANF program, okay? And I'm not going to complain about that. And these 790 people. You don't see any, point is, you don't see any able-bodied male adults in this program. If you're an able-bodied male adult in Puerto Rico, there's no office you can go to for cash. There's no such thing. It's a myth that you can do that. Now, there's 14.2% that are able-bodied women that are not disabled, but they tend to, again, have minor children, and some of the children have disabilities. So did welfare cause declining employment, or was the declining employment the cause of people going on welfare? You know, the age-old chicken and egg question. So I look at the data again. The red line is the employment that Harry showed you. The declining employment since 2006, right? The blue line is the proportion of TANF cases, people on welfare. When you do the chronology, look at the red arrow, that's where the employment begins to decline. And you look next to it, there's TANF continues to decline as employment declines, but then employment is, starts really hitting people, and then they start going on the TANF program. So when you arrange the causality, employment declines happen first, and then by about a year, TANF starts to increase. So the chicken and egg, the egg is the employment, and the chicken is the TANF program. Employment collapses first, and then people take up the program, as you can clearly see from the chronology of this graph. And then I did the PAN program, and you see the same thing. The red line is employment. The collapse in employment, and what happens after employment collapses is the blue line, an increase in PAN. People lose jobs, then they apply for nutritional assistance of $300 a month for a family of 3. It's not that the PAN is all the way high up here, and then somehow something happens to the employment. I think the causality on both of these in terms of what happens first and what happens second is fairly clear. So, is welfare a disincentive to work, and able-bodied working-age males can get welfare easily? Puerto Rico has relatively low TANF participation rates. Puerto Rico has relatively low TANF benefit levels. There are no males without disability in the TANF program, of 790 out of the 60-some thousand. TANF caseloads follow the pattern of changes in employment, as do the PAN caseloads. And welfare participation does not appear to explain male labor supply, and it may have limited role in explaining the labor supply of females, because again, there are young women, poor, with 2 minor children, typically being abandoned by their husband, that are in this program. And again, that's a social policy question. There are about 10% of the population in the program for whom the benefits pay more than the work. And again, if you 10%, if you ask me as a social policy person, should society have a program so that young women that are poor, that have 2 minor children that have been abandoned by their partners, get on their feet and feed their children while they'll then get to the labor market full time? I would say, yeah, that makes sense to me. I don't want to kick them to the labor market immediately thereafter. There should be that's what the program's there for. So if a program exists, I'm not going to complain people using it. I don't know how much time I have. I'll take another 5 minutes, sorry. The minimum wage is too high. Listen, if it's good for the goose, why is it good for the gander? So if the minimum wage has been in Puerto Rico in operation from the time the employment was going up and from the time the employment was going down. So if minimum wage is good to explain the collapse in employment, why isn't it good to explain the increase in employment? Catch my drift? That's the kind of hypocrisy of the minimum wage argument, that somehow it begins in 2006 to have an effect. Well, if you give credit to the minimum wage for increasing employment for 25 years in Puerto Rico, and then I'll take the hit of having it reduced employment for 10 years in Puerto Rico. But the only thing that happened in 2006 that we can track that has this effect on the employment was the loss of financial incentive subsidies and those firms leaving. The minimum wage doesn't explain this labor market. And then let's look at data on wage levels and compare. Again, another one where I don't want you to even see the numbers. I just want you to see where Puerto Rico is. That's the average and median hourly wage for every single state and the 3 territories, DC, Guam, and the Virgin Islands. And that's where Puerto Rico is. Where does it look like to you where that it is? The column, the row below Puerto Rico says total. At the bottom, and by far, Puerto Rico is 942. The other 2 on top of Puerto Rico, who are they? Guam and the Virgin Islands, folks. I want Puerto Rico to catch up to Guam and the Virgin Islands. Forget the 50 states and DC, who's the top state. Okay, the average hourly wage, median hourly wage in the Virgin Islands is $12.36. The median hourly wage in Guam is $12.37. And the bottom, the median hourly wage in Puerto Rico is $9.42. Which is about 56% of the US average of $16.81. So the question I ask for those that say the minimum wage is too high is, how low should it go? How much lower do you want it to be? In other words, how much lower do wages in Puerto Rico have to be before wages in Puerto Rico start catching up to the rest of the states? What's the economic model and logic of that? If I find the economists that can explain to me, and I've been looking and I asked on Twitter and all of that, and I don't get anyone that can explain to me how lowering wages increases wages. But again, I may be too complicated or too dense for those things. And then I did, okay, so let me plot the state's employment to population ratio by the state's hourly wage. And guess what you find? Puerto Rico's at the very bottom, right? 9 something. And 20-some% employment to population ratio. That's just the employed persons divided by the entire population of the place, okay? It's not the best denominator, but it's one that's constant for all the states. The relationship is that, guess what? The higher the wages, the higher the employment. That's what I drew the arrow kind of where we would draw a regression line through those points. And it's what folks in the business call a positive relationship, okay? Not a negative relationship. The place with the highest employment is the place with the highest wages. Up there you see it, DC. There's more people in DC, there's more employed people in DC than the residents of DC, because they commute from Virginia and Maryland, and they also make the highest freaking wages in the country, at about 28 some on average, okay? So when you plot the relationship between wages and employment, you find that more wages go with more employment, not kind of the other way around. So I don't find a lot of evidence for the minimum wage being the real problem in Puerto Rico for a lot of reasons. And again, that's an area where I do a lot more slides. And then there's a colleague, Arin Dubé from the University of Massachusetts, who wrote a really thoughtful essay. He's the nation's leading expert on minimum wage research, basically saying when you look at the evidence, the case is very weak, that the minimum wage is really the problem in Puerto Rico. The problem in Puerto Rico is lack of good jobs, you know. It's an employment problem. So what does Krueger see? Let me close here. Krueger recipe for Puerto Rico. She sees a low-skilled place with employment laws that are too generous, with a minimum wage that is too high, with welfare that is too generous, where welfare is a disincentive to work, and with low labor force participation, because people don't want to work, they rather sit and chill. So the solution from the report is cut welfare, cut wages, cut benefits, and eliminate labor laws. And that's what all the working groups from the government are supposed to be doing and supposed to be releasing tomorrow, though, as Harry mentioned, they're afraid to say this. They need to say it for the bondholders, so the bondholders think they're doing the hard work and putting pressure on their own people, but politically, it's a suicidal move. So it's going to be interesting to see how they're going to do that dance over the next couple of days. But again, so the path that Krueger wants to draw, if we will go back to that path, is they want more employment, but they don't care about wages. That's the red line. You can increase Puerto Rico's labor force participation at a cheaper wage. That's the path that they're pointing to. And you know, slavery was a full employment economy, right? There was no unemployment under slavery. But we object to that kind of full employment economy, right? We don't think that's fair. And you know, similarly, I would say to our US masters that, you know, paying the cheapest wages to Puerto Ricans ain't no way to treat your colony, you know? Treat us with some respect and pay us what we're worth. Don't tell us that we're worth less than any other citizen. And that's kind of where we are today. So I think Puerto Rico should go the tried and true path that every other state has followed. Higher wages lead to more employment. So the problem in Puerto Rico is not that the wages are too high, it's that they're too low. And people rather just, so the consequences that I see if we follow the Krueger recipe, I promise I'm wrapping up. Reduce power of workers and more inequality. Lower labor protections and more abuse at work. If you reduce if you change the probationary period and you can fire people for no cost in a labor market where there's such an abundant labor supply, employers can get away with murder. And you can work hard and you fired the next day because there's 20 people that can take your job. And now that I have even lower minimum wage, it's a buyer's market. I can do with you whatever I want. Is that really what we want? Is that progress for Puerto Rico? More desperate workers and more labor market circulation. People, rather than staying in one job for a long period of time, they're going to be fired and hired and fired and hired. There's going to be all this kind of circulation for people to try to make ends meet. Higher poverty rates and needier populations is what I see. Lower standards of living and quality of life, and an increased wage gap and continued migration, which is kind of where we come in the picture. A couple of days ago, I just figured, you know, let me get the data for Puerto Ricans in the US and compare them to Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, because we're talking about who should we be compared to Latin America, to the US, well, let's compare Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico to Puerto Ricans in the US. What you see there is the age earnings profile. The red line is Puerto Rico, the blue line is the United States. So say you're a 16-year-old, starting at the bottom, right? You can, and everything else is equal, and you can take two roads to your future. One is the I stay in Puerto Rico road, that's the red path, or I go to the US road, and that's what Puerto Ricans in the US are making, that's the blue path. So essentially, a 24-year-old in the US makes as much as a 42-year-old in the US, in Puerto Rico. Let me say that again, a 24-year-old in the US, Puerto Rican, makes as much as a 40-year-old in Puerto Rico. And that amount that the 40-year-old makes in Puerto Rico, it's the peak They're not gonna make any average higher than $20,000. Look at the rest of the afro. I call this graph my hair when I was young graph. Okay? So what the people in Puerto Rico want to do is to push that red line even lower because the wages are too high, right? It's too generous. So the gap is going to increase. Guess what? Any person with some sense is going to say, what the hell am I going to stay here for? When I can go to the US and in 10 years I can make what I can make here in a lifetime. I leave at 20, come back at 35, which is what everybody says, and they never come back, but that's another story. That's by education. So this is how much folk by education make in the US, the blue line, and in Puerto Rico, the red line. Again, what they want to do in Puerto Rico is to push it down. Let me just close with this one. That's the kind of percentile earning. So the blue line, the 99 percentile of earners in Puerto Ricans in the US make about $145,000 on average. The top earners, Puerto Ricans in the US. Top earners, Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, make about $100,000, right? And the two arrows I drew, a Puerto Rican in the US that's on the 56th percentile makes as much as a Puerto Rican that's on the 80th percentile. Those are the red and the blue lines, right? And again, what they want to do is to push this Puerto Rico line further down. Now, Puerto Rico does have a steep increase on the back end, right? There's a lot of, what that means is that there's an inequality pushing people at the higher end. So the last myth that I kind of forgot is this low-wage workers and the poor and other vulnerable populations are to blame for the financial and economic crisis. And I don't have a lot of graphs and data for that. No, they're not. It's kind of my answer. But in the end, this is about more than numbers. This is a debate about fairness and about rights. Do we believe that there's poverty in Puerto Rico? Because there are people that believe that there's no poverty in Puerto Rico. It's just people chilling in their couches getting welfare. They're not really poor. They're not the kind of deserving poor that we remember. Really? So first, do we believe there's poverty in Puerto Rico? Or do we believe that Puerto Ricans are the richest poor people in the world? Or the richest poor people in Latin America? That's nonsense. There's real poverty and hunger in Puerto Rico. Just take a walk to places where you normally don't walk, and you'll see it. Now, the place looks pretty because there's a lot of mirrors, and $72 billion later, lend $72 billion to any Latin American country, and you see buildings pop up all over the place, and the place looks pretty. But we're screwed for that because it's a mirage. We don't owe that stuff. We don't own it. We owe it. and there's a big difference. So are citizens entitled to a minimum standard of living? To opportunities for a better future? If people are entitled to food assistance, then why complain that they get food assistance? If they're entitled to housing, why complain they get housing? If they're entitled to healthcare, why complain they get healthcare? Those things should not be part of the comparison. Oh, it's too generous because people in Puerto Rico can get food, can get welfare, can get housing. What are they complaining about? Hell, So how should social resources be allocated to provide for that standard? The last slide I'll put is this one, which is, the money being made in Puerto Rico. The thing is, who's making the money in Puerto Rico? And I divided the population into 5 groups of 20%. Let's call them the bottom 20%, the next 20%, the next 20%, the next 20%, and the top 20%. And then I took the cake, and I said, okay, how much of a dollar, that's 100%, would go to each of those percentages in terms of the money that's being made in Puerto Rico? Well, guess what? The bottom 20% of people in Puerto Rico will get a penny, 1 cent of that dollar. Out of every dollar that's made in Puerto Rico, the bottom 20%, that's about 760,000 people get a penny. The next 20% get 8%. So the bottom 40% in Puerto Rico make 9% of the money. That's about 1.4 million people, 1.5 million people, make 9% of all the money. Third and the fourth, let's go to the top 20%. They make 55% of the dollar, right? So the top 20%, those 797 privileged families that come here with a suntan telling us to work harder to sustain them back in Puerto Rico, right? They're fine. They're making 55% of every dollar in Puerto Rico, that top 20%. I compared it to the US households and the US families. And the bottom row there is the top 5% of people in Puerto Rico. They make 25% of all the money. So 95% of the people eat 75%, and 5% of the people, the top 5, eat 25%. And the top 20% eat 55%, more than half of the pie for the top 20%. There's still 80% of the people we have to feed with what's left. And if you just take the top 40%, forget it. You have 14 plus 8 plus 1 to feed 60% of the population. You see where I'm going, right? Problem in Puerto Rico is inequality, and it's who's making the money, and we don't hear anything about that in any of these reports. Why? Because the elite in Puerto Rico doesn't want you to hear about any of this stuff. They don't want to tax themselves. They'd rather tax you here in the US so you can pay and support the population over there. And they'd rather come to you here with a sing and crying and barrilito tres estrellas. So they can say, yeah, we want you to lobby and solve our problems here in Puerto Rico, whereas we don't want to tax ourselves and we're not going to make the hard decisions to pay what we need to pay to support our population and stop stealing the money, which is kind of what they've been doing. So let me finish there with a kind of caption contest. And I'll let you figure out where the story ends. Okay? Is the Puerto Rican diaspora going to continue to play this game of doing whatever the elites in Puerto Rico want us to do so that they can maintain their nice standard of living while the rest of us work here at rear ends? Or are we going to start demanding some rights as a diaspora and say, okay, we'll help you. How about giving us a couple of senators in that Puerto Rican legislature you have there? How about giving us some representatives at large? So that we're not town mayors, we're not giving out cement or bricks to people. We're there for transparency and accountability. But we don't do that, right? And we let the Puerto Rican elites tell us, oh, you left. So you have none to say here. Well, we support our families, we support it. Who supports the airline industry, the rental-car industry, the hotel industry, the restaurant industry in Puerto Rico? But if not us. So if we don't have a right to go tell our brothers and sisters there to put their crap in order, then I don't know who does. And I think it behooves us to have that kind of attitude because not having it has cost us dearly. And it's going to cost our family, friends, and relatives in Puerto Rico a lot more. Thank you.